Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Murmurs, where dreams melt into shadows and stories float through your sleep, videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying tonight's tale, The House That Dreamed. Let's begin. There was a house on the hill, its windows dark, and its walls heavy with the secrets of forgotten years. And as the night grew thicker, the air around it seemed to hum with a strange, almost imperceptible vibration, like something was breathing beneath the floorboards deep in the shadows, and the wind, though calm, carried whispers that weren't carried by the wind, soft murmurs that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves, like the house was trying to speak, to share something it had kept hidden for generations. Yet nobody who had ever lived there dared listen long enough to hear, because there was something about the house, something unsettling in the way it loomed over the town, a place no one ever spoke of, but no one could ever forget. And as the moon rose high above, casting pale light across the overgrown yard, the shadows in the windows seemed to stretch and twist, almost as if they were alive, moving, watching, and waiting. And though the silence was oppressive, it wasn't complete. For if you listened carefully enough, if you dared listen long enough, you would hear a sound, faint at first, then growing, like the soft scrape of fingernails on wood, or a whisper just on the edge of hearing, carried on the air, as if the house was trying to make you understand something, but you could never quite catch it. And those who passed by always hurried, never looking back, afraid that if they did, they might see something, or worse, they might hear it, for no one could say what the house was or what it wanted. But everyone knew it was not empty, not by a long shot, for the house that dreamed, the house that watched, never truly left anyone who crossed its threshold. And each time the wind would stir, each time the night would fall, those who knew would glance nervously toward the hill, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on their backs, and wonder, just for a moment, what might be waiting for them in the dark rooms of the house that never truly slept, the house that dreamed, with its secrets hidden in every corner, its whispers curling around the edges of your mind like a forgotten nightmare, just out of reach, just enough to make you question what was real and what was simply a dream that might one day come for you. And as the clock struck midnight, the house seemed to sigh, a deep, mournful sound, as if it were settling in for the night, its dreams waiting to take root once more. And in that silence, there was a promise that no matter how far you ran, no matter how long you lived, the house would always be there, waiting for the moment when you would finally understand what it had been whispering all along. And on one particularly quiet evening, when the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading rain, a traveler arrived at the foot of the hill, weary from his journey, looking for a place to rest, a place to sleep, though the town had long since warned him against coming near, as if the very earth around the house itself carried a warning. But he had heard the stories, heard the whispers in the villages far beyond, tales of the house that never truly slept, that it had once been full of laughter, full of life, a place of joy and family. But over time, that laughter faded into silence, and the light from the windows dimmed until only shadows remained. And those shadows were not the kind you could simply walk away from. They were the kind that followed, that clung to the edges of your mind, turning the mundane into something strange, something unfamiliar. And as the traveler climbed the winding path to the door, Something inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't explain, but a pull that felt almost natural. And when his hand reached the brass handle, cold and slick beneath his fingers, he hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because it felt as if the house itself were waiting for him, as if it had always known he would come. And with a deep breath, he pushed open the door, its hinges groaning in protest. But it was not the sound of a house in decay. No, it was a sound that felt familiar, like an old friend greeting you after a long separation. And as he stepped inside, the air was cool, thick with the smell of something ancient, something untouched. And though there were no lights, no lamps to guide his way, the darkness seemed to have a life of its own. The kind of darkness that whispered, that moved, that shifted as if the shadows themselves had something to hide. And as he walked deeper into the hall, his steps echoing through the empty rooms, there was a chill that crawled up his spine, not from the cold, but from something more, something that clung to the walls, to the very foundation of the house. And with each step, he felt as though the house was drawing closer, pulling him in. And though he tried to ignore the feeling, tried to dismiss the sense that he was not alone, that the house was watching, he couldn't shake the unease. And then just as he reached the foot of the stairs, he heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, a voice so faint that it seemed to melt into the air itself. But it was there, and though he couldn't make out the words, he felt them in his bones, a message meant only for him. And though his heart raced, though his mind screamed for him to turn and leave, he found himself moving upward toward the sound, toward the pulse of the house, as though it had claimed him, as though it had waited for him. And the higher he climbed, the more the air seemed to thicken. The darker the shadows grew, stretching across the walls, twisting into shapes that didn't quite belong. And the whisper grew louder, clearer, but still unintelligible. And it was then that he realized that the house was not just alive in the way that a home is. No, this house had a soul, a consciousness of its own. And it was speaking, not with words, but with its very presence. And as he reached the top of the stairs, the house seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. And then, in that moment of perfect silence, a door creaked open in the distance, and the whisper, once a murmur, became a sigh. And he knew without a doubt that he was no longer just in the house. He was part of it, and the house was waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to hear the truth it had been trying to tell for so long. But the truth, as it always is with the house that dreamed, was far more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The door that had creaked open ahead of him seemed to pulse with an unseen force, like it was calling to him, whispering his name in a way that felt too familiar, too personal, as though it had known him all along. And his hand moved without thinking, without hesitation, as though it were not his own but guided by something deeper, something older. And when the door swung wide, the room beyond revealed itself, shrouded in shadow but not in darkness. No, this was a darkness that had depth, that seemed to absorb light, to pull it in and fold it into itself, as if the room were not part of the house at all, but a separate world unto its own. And inside there were no walls, no ceiling, just endless space stretching out before him, as though the room were infinite. And yet at its center there stood an old dust-covered chair, and in that chair sat a figure, its back to him, cloaked in shadow. But the faint outline of a face could be seen, pale and indistinct, like a memory too distant to fully recall. And before he could speak, before he could move, The figure's head turned slowly, and though its face remained hidden, the traveler felt the gaze, the weight of it pressing on him, heavy and suffocating. And it was then that the whispers began again. But this time, they were louder, clearer, and the traveler could make out the words, just enough to understand their meaning. Though the words were not in any language he knew, they were the sound of forgotten dreams, of nightmares too old to remember. And as the whispers wrapped themselves around his mind, pulling him deeper into the house, the figure in the chair began to speak, its voice low, slow, and soothing, yet carrying an undertone of something darker, something primal. "You've come to understand, haven't you?" it asked, and the traveler felt his throat tighten, his heart racing, as if the question itself were a trap, as if answering would be the same as admitting defeat. But he could not speak, could not move, for the house had already begun its work, and the figure in the chair continued. "The house that dreams, the house that remembers, we are one, you and I. And this place, this forgotten home, has always been yours to walk, always been yours to claim. And yet, you never truly knew it, did you?" And with those words, the house seemed to breathe, the air thickening as the walls around him shifted, closing in, not physically, but mentally, the space growing tighter, more oppressive. And as the figure's words sank into his mind, he could feel the house, feel it pulling him, connecting him to something deeper, something older than time itself. And then the shadows that had been stretching along the walls began to move, to twist and writhe, forming shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, figures without form, yet strangely familiar, as if they were memories, broken and distorted. And the traveler could hear them, faintly at first, then louder, louder still, as if they were calling to him, pulling him closer. And he realized with a shock that the whispers were not just in the room, not just in the house. They were in his head, in his very thoughts, as though the house had always been a part of him. And now it was waking, waking inside him. And the figure in the chair stood, slowly, deliberately. And as it did, the shadows around the room seemed to take shape, taking on form, filling the space with figures that surrounded him, standing just out of reach. And though he couldn't see their faces, he knew they were watching, waiting. And the figure reached out a hand, pale and thin, its fingers long and sharp, like the branches of an ancient tree. And it beckoned to him, slowly. And in that moment, the traveler realized what he had known all along, but had refused to accept. The house had never been empty. It had never been abandoned. For the house that dreamed had always been alive. And he was the one who had been asleep. And as the figure's hand drew closer, the whispers intensified, rising to a crescendo until they filled the room, filled his mind, until there was nothing left but the sound of them. And then, as if in response, the house itself seemed to shift, to come alive. And in that moment, the traveler knew, with an unsettling certainty, that the house would never let him go. For the house that dreamed had always been waiting for him, and now he was part of it, forever. The house, now fully awake, seemed to pulse with life, the walls vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the deep, steady rhythm of a heartbeat that never stopped, that never rested. And as the figure's hand drew closer, the traveler felt an odd sense of inevitability, as though his fate had already been sealed the moment he stepped through the door. The moment the house had called him, and now, standing at the edge of something far beyond his understanding, He felt the weight of the shadows surrounding him, pressing in on him, filling his chest with a strange pressure, and as the figure's hand finally touched his, cold and unyielding, the house seemed to exhale, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay, and for a moment the traveler thought he could hear something, something far off, just on the edge of his perception, a sound that didn't belong to this world, but before he could focus on it, the shadows began to shift, to move, their edges growing sharper, more defined, until they became shapes. Dark figures standing in the corners of the room, watching, waiting, and though they didn't move, didn't speak, the traveler could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment, and as the figure in the chair stepped forward, its form now fully visible in the dim light, he saw its face, pale and hollow, its eyes dark and empty, like wells that went on forever. And though he couldn't look away, he felt a cold shiver run through him, as if the figure were not truly standing there, but instead was a part of the house itself, an extension of it. And as the figure's voice came again, low and slow, it seemed to echo, not in the room, but in his mind. And the words it spoke were not words at all, but feelings, emotions that pressed on him like the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "You were always meant to be here," it said, and the house seemed to respond, the shadows shifting, the air thickening, as if it were alive, alive in a way that nothing else could be. And then the traveler understood. He understood everything. In that one terrifying moment, the truth that had been buried so deep beneath the house's walls, beneath its dreams, the truth that he had been running from for so long, that the house was not just a home, not just a place, but something older, something far older, a presence that had always been, that had always dreamed, and now it had found him, and he was no longer just a visitor, no longer just a traveler. He was a part of it, bound to the house, to its dreams. And as the figure stepped back, its eyes never leaving him, the shadows around him began to close in, tightening until there was no space left, until the room was filled with nothing but the sound of his own breathing, the sound of his own heartbeat, as though the house had taken them, had taken him. And in that moment, he realized that he was no longer himself. He was part of the house, part of the dream, and there would be no waking, no escaping. For the house that dreamed had never been a place. It had always been a part of him, and now he was the dream. And as the darkness deepened, the whispers came again. But this time, they were not just whispers. They were voices, clear and distinct, calling his name, urging him to listen, to understand, to remember. And though he tried to resist, though he tried to run, he couldn't move, couldn't escape, for the house had already claimed him, and there was no going back, no waking from the dream. For the house that dreamed had always been waiting for him, and now it would never let him leave. As the house settled back into its unnatural stillness, the traveler found himself in a place beyond time, beyond memory, as though the boundaries between the 785th and the 786th had been erased real world, and the dream world had dissolved, and there was only the house, vast and endless, stretching out in every direction, an infinite labyrinth of rooms and corridors that twisted and bent in ways that defied logic. And he couldn't tell if he was walking or floating, if his feet were even touching the ground. For the floor beneath him felt soft, like earth, like it was alive, pulsing with a rhythm of its own. And with each step, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, more insistent, as if they were reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the house, into its very heart. And though he tried to speak, to call out, no sound came, only the faint rustle of whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a light, faint but unmistakable, glowing from behind a door at the far end of the corridor. And despite the chill creeping up his spine, despite the feeling that something terrible awaited him there, he found himself walking toward it, drawn by some unseen force. For he had long since lost control, long since become part of the house, part of its dream. And as he reached the door, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was warning him, trying to make him understand that once he passed through that door, there would be no return, no going back to the world he had known. But it was too late, for his hand was already on the doorknob, and as he turned it, the door swung open on its own, revealing a room unlike any he had seen before, a room bathed in an eerie, soft light, and at the center of the room stood a mirror, tall and wide, its surface perfectly smooth, reflecting not just the room, but something else, something that felt wrong, something that made his heart race. For the reflection staring back at him was not his own, not entirely. It was him. Yes, but there was something about it, something off, as though the reflection were a version of him, a shadow of himself, but not quite the same. And as he looked closer, his reflection began to move, to shift, as though it had a life of its own, and his own body froze, rooted to the spot, unable to look away, unable to turn from the mirror. And then the reflection smiled, a slow, unnerving smile that was not his own. And though his mouth did not move, though he did not speak, he heard the words, whispered softly in his mind, "You've come home at last." And with those words, the room seemed to close in, the walls stretching outward, the mirror growing larger until it filled his entire vision, until there was nothing but the reflection, the smiling figure staring back at him. And as the whispers rose to a crescendo, he felt something shift inside him, deep within his chest, like something was being torn away, like his very soul was being pulled from his body. And in that moment, he realized, with a horrifying clarity, that the house was not just a place, it was a living thing, a creature that fed on the souls of those who entered, that trapped them within its walls, within its dreams. And now he was nothing more than a part of it, a new shadow in its endless night. And as the reflection reached out from the mirror, its hand crossing the boundary between the real world and the dream world, the traveler felt himself falling into the depths of the house, into the place where time had no meaning, where nothing could escape, not even memory. And as the mirror's surface rippled like water disturbed by an unseen force, he knew that he was lost forever in the house that dreamed, a house that never woke, a house that never let go. The darkness that swallowed him felt different now, colder, deeper, as though the very essence of the house had become one with him. And as he fell, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, the forgotten memories, the whispers of those who had come before, each one lost to the house, swallowed by its insatiable hunger. And as the blackness enveloped him, he realized that he was no longer just a visitor, no longer just a stranger stumbling through the halls. He was part of it, a fragment of the house's dream. And in that moment, he understood something far more terrible than he had ever imagined, that the house was not a place, not a structure of wood and stone, but a living entity, a being that fed on dreams, that consumed the essence of those who dared enter. And it had waited for him, for his soul, his mind, and now that it had him, it would never let him go. The house had always dreamed, and now it would continue to dream with him trapped inside, a prisoner of its never-ending slumber. Time lost all meaning as he drifted in the dark, unable to move, unable to escape. And though the house seemed vast and endless, it felt as though it were shrinking, folding in on itself, compressing his very being into a single fragile thread of existence. And somewhere in the distance, a sound reached his ears, soft at first, like a heartbeat, like the ticking of a clock, but it grew louder, faster, and he realized with a start that it was not a sound at all. It was the whispering, the endless murmuring of the house, the voices of those who had come before, now trapped within its walls, their souls forever bound to the dream. And as he listened, he heard them speaking, their voices overlapping, their words tumbling over one another, as though they were desperate to be heard, desperate to warn him, to tell him that there was no escape, that the house would never let him leave, that once you entered, you could never truly leave. And though he wanted to scream, though he wanted to run, he found himself paralyzed, his body a mere shell, an empty vessel. And as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, a figure appeared in the distance, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. And though its form was blurred, its outline shifting like smoke, he could feel its presence, its cold, oppressive gaze locking onto him. And as it drew closer, he saw the face, pale, hollow, its eyes dark voids that seemed to devour the light. And though he could not move, could not speak, the figure reached out a hand and he felt it, the icy chill of its touch as it slid across his skin, a cold that went deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, until it reached the very core of his being. And in that moment, he understood, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that the house had always known him, had always been waiting for him, for this moment. And now that he was here, now that he had crossed the threshold, there was no going back. The house was his home, and he was its prisoner. And as the figure's hand tightened around his wrist, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, the voices of the house, of the dream, of those who had been consumed by its hunger. And as he looked into the figure's empty eyes, he saw it. He saw the truth that had always been there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The house was not just a dream, it was a trap, a never-ending cycle of longing and despair, and he was now a part of it, forever. As the figure's grip tightened, the traveler felt the last remnants of his self slip away, as though he were dissolving, fading into the very air of the house, becoming one with the whispers, the shadows, the dream. And in that moment, he understood the true nature of the house, the terrible secret it had kept hidden for so long. The house didn't just trap souls, it consumed them, turning them into fragments of its dream. And now he was one of those fragments, a piece of the house's eternal, restless slumber. The shadows around him shifted, swirled, and he could feel the cold embrace of the house's dark heart beating in time with his own, its pulse slow, deliberate, but unyielding. And as he looked around, the world seemed to shift, the walls bending, the floor rising and falling, as if the house itself were alive, breathing, moving, and he could hear it, feel it in his chest, the rhythm of the house, its whispers becoming clearer, more distinct, as if they were speaking directly to him now, telling him what he had known all along, that the house had never been abandoned, never been empty. It had always been waiting for someone like him, someone who would wander in, someone who would become part of its dream, part of its endless hunger. The house that dreamed had never been a place. It had been a prison for the souls of those who had come before. And now it would hold him forever, locked in its eternal embrace. The shadows around him seemed to reach for him, pulling him deeper into the darkness, into the heart of the house. And as the whispers grew louder, the house seemed to close in on him, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own heartbeat, the sound of the house's breath, and the endless dream that would never end. But even in the darkest depths of the house, even as he felt himself slipping further away from the world he had once known, a part of him fought back, a small, fragile thread of resistance that refused to be consumed by the dream. He tried to scream, tried to call out, but no sound came. No voice reached the outside world, for the house had swallowed it all, every memory, every hope, until only the dream remained. And yet, despite the overwhelming darkness, despite the suffocating weight of the house pressing down on him, the traveler found himself thinking of the world outside, of the sun, of the open sky, of the life he had once lived. And as the whispers grew louder, as the shadows closed in, he made a decision, one final desperate choice: to fight, to resist, to not become just another forgotten piece of the house's endless dream. And though he knew it was futile, though he knew there was no escaping the house, he felt something stir deep within him, a flicker of defiance, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. And with that spark, he reached out into the darkness, into the endless void of the house. And for a brief moment, the whispers paused, the shadows stilled, and the house seemed to wait, as if it too were holding its breath. And then, with a final, determined push, he broke free. He didn't know how. He didn't know why. But in that moment, he was free, free from the house, free from its dream. And though he didn't know what awaited him beyond the darkness, he knew one thing for certain. The house had dreamed him into existence, but now he would never be its prisoner again. The dream was over, and he was awake. The house's pulse, slow and steady, seemed to echo in his bones, reverberating through the hollow corridors and rooms that never truly ended. He could feel it now. The house wasn't just alive, it was watching him, its walls stretching outward like the arms of a sleeping beast, pulling him deeper into its grasp. The air was thick with something ancient, something oppressive, as if the very breath of the house was smothering him, holding him in place, paralyzing him with a creeping sense of dread. And for a long moment, he stood there, unable to move, unable to turn back, as the walls around him seemed to whisper his name, each breath of air carrying the faintest, most unsettling voice, a voice that felt like a distant memory, like a forgotten nightmare that had been waiting for him. He took a step forward, then another, his feet heavy, reluctant, as if the very ground beneath him had become something else, something foreign, pulling at him, dragging him deeper into the bowels of the house. And every step he took, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers but voices, clear, distinct, each one calling to him, urging him to listen, to remember, to understand. But he couldn't, not yet. The words slipped away like smoke, like shadows, and each time he tried to catch them, they dissolved, slipping through his fingers, leaving nothing but the dark, empty air around him. And as he walked deeper into the heart of the house, he began to see them, figures, shadowy forms that flickered at the edges of his vision, never quite solid, never quite real, but there, all the same. And though he couldn't make out their faces, couldn't tell if they were human or something else entirely. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their gaze, pressing down on him, suffocating him with their silent judgment. And as he passed each room, each door, he felt something strange, like he was walking through memories that weren't his own, like the house was showing him the lives of those who had come before him, their stories frozen in time, their fates sealed within the walls. And with each memory, each glimpse of the past, he could feel the house growing stronger, feeding off the emotions, the fear, the regret, the sorrow of those who had been lost to it. And he realized with a sinking feeling in his chest that he was no longer just a visitor. He was part of it, a new thread woven into the tapestry of the house's endless dream. And there would be no waking, no escape. As he continued down the endless corridors, the darkness seemed to deepen, thickening around him like a living thing, a weight that pressed against his chest, his lungs, making it harder to breathe. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, they grew louder, more desperate, until they filled his mind. A constant, unrelenting sound that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. And he wondered, for a brief moment, if he had already lost his mind, if this was the end. But he could not stop. He could not turn back. The house would not allow it. The walls seemed to close in, pressing him forward, guiding him deeper into the house's labyrinth. And though he tried to resist, to push back against the unseen force that tugged at him, he found himself moving forward, each step pulling him further into the depths of the house, each whisper pushing him towards something, something that called to him, something that wanted him, needed him to come closer. And as he rounded a corner, he saw it, a door, old and weathered, its wood rotting at the edges, its surface covered in a layer of dust and grime that had accumulated over what seemed like centuries. And though he couldn't explain why, he knew. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this door was different. It wasn't like the others. This door was the heart of the house. This was the place where everything began and everything would end. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and as he touched it, a jolt of cold shot through him, like a shock of electricity. And for a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he should turn back, if he should flee while he still could. But the thought was fleeting, drowned out by the whispers, the voices, all the souls of the house calling to him, urging him to open the door, to step through it. And without another thought, he twisted the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, ghostly light, a light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. And as he stepped inside, he felt the weight of history, the weight of every soul that had ever entered the house, pressing down on him, surrounding him, and in the center of the room, on a pedestal, stood something that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. An object, old and mysterious, its surface cracked and worn, but its presence unmistakable, like an ancient artifact. Something that had been here long before the house had even existed. And as he reached out to touch it, a wave of energy shot through him, flooding his mind with visions, with memories that weren't his, with lives that he had never lived. And he saw it, saw the house as it once was, alive, vibrant, full of people, full of dreams, full of hopes. And then he saw the darkness creep in, saw the whispers begin, saw the house's true nature revealed, not just a place of shelter, not just a home, but a prison, a trap, a thing that consumed everything it touched. And he realized, with a horrible clarity, that he had not stumbled upon the house by accident. He had been drawn here, drawn to this moment. And now he was part of it, a part of the house's dream, forever. As his fingers brushed against the surface of the object, a shudder ran through him, as if the house itself had drawn a breath. The light in the room flickered, dimming and brightening in an erratic pattern, as though the house were reacting to his touch, to his presence. He could feel it now. The object, whatever it was calling to him, pulling at him, demanding his attention. And as he stared at it, his mind swam with images, fractured, distorted, like broken glass being pieced back together. He saw the house again, not as it was now, but as it had once been. A beautiful, sprawling manor, alive with laughter, with movement, with people, families, friends, strangers, all coming together under its roof, all sharing in its warmth, its comfort, its safety. But then, the shadows began to creep in, as they always did, and the whispers started, slow at first, like a faint breeze. But then they grew, rising with the same hunger that seemed to feed the very air around him. And he saw it. He saw the turning point, the moment when everything changed. The house had been alive, yes, but it had become something else, something darker, something that fed on the very souls of those who entered its domain. And as the whispers grew louder, the house began to hunger, to consume, to dream of things far worse than death itself. He saw the first soul trapped within its walls, saw the terror in their eyes as they realized the fate that awaited them. And then another, and another, and the house had continued to dream, continued to pull people in, trapping them within its endless halls, its never-ending corridors, until there was nothing left but the whispers, the shadows, and the dreams of those who had been lost. And now he was one of them. He felt the weight of the house's gaze upon him, 1,000 eyes watching, waiting, and with a sudden, overwhelming certainty, he knew that the house was not just alive. It was alive with the souls of the lost, the souls of those who had come before him, those who had been consumed by its dream, and now he was becoming one with them. His own soul was beginning to slip away, to dissolve into the very fabric of the house. And no matter how much he fought, no matter how much he tried to hold on to his identity, he felt it, the pull, the draw of the house urging him to let go, to surrender to the dream, to become one with it, to become part of the endless cycle of its hunger. The whispers became clearer now, more distinct, their voices merging with his own thoughts, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. And he could hear them, feel them, as if they were speaking directly to him. "You are one of us now," they whispered. "You will never leave. You will never escape." His breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest, and he tried to pull away, tried to tear himself from the pedestal, but his hands were frozen, his body locked in place, as if the very air around him had become solid, pressing in on him, trapping him, and he could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something far older than the house itself, something that had been waiting for him, watching him from the shadows. And as his gaze lifted from the object, he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, those eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light, piercing through the gloom, locking onto him with a gaze that felt like it was pulling at his very soul. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the room seemed to shift, the walls bending, the light flickering and warping, and the whispers rose in volume, now frantic, urgent, as if the house itself were reacting to the figure's presence. The figure's footsteps echoed through the room, each step sending a tremor through the very ground beneath him, until it stood before him, its face still hidden in shadow. And then the voice came, soft, slow, but filled with a terrible weight, as if it carried the burden of centuries. "You have come too far," the figure whispered, and the traveler's heart skipped a beat. "You should have turned back. Now there is no escape." The figure reached out a hand, and though its touch was light, it felt like 1,000 cold fingers brushing against his skin, sending a wave of ice through his veins. The house seemed to stir, reacting to the figure's presence, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, breathing, feeding off the fear and the confusion that had settled deep in the traveler's heart. The figure's voice came again, this time more insistent, more commanding, as if it were the very voice of the house itself. "You belong to it now," it said, and the traveler could feel the truth of those words settling in his chest like a heavy stone. "The house has claimed you. Your soul is its, as are the souls of all who walk through its doors. You are nothing more than a whisper in its dream, a shadow in its endless night." And yet, despite the overwhelming weight of those words, despite the suffocating grip the house had on him, a part of him fought back. A flicker of defiance, however small, remained within him, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort, and though his body felt as if it were made of stone, though every muscle screamed in protest, he reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the object on the pedestal once more. For a moment, nothing happened. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and then, without warning, a sharp pain shot through his chest, and he cried out, unable to stop it, as a wave of energy flooded through him, overwhelming his senses, drowning him in an ocean of light and sound. And for a brief moment, the room was no longer a room. It was a vast, endless expanse, a place outside of time, outside of the house, a place where the whispers could not reach, where the darkness could not touch him. And in that place, he saw it, the truth, the heart of the house, the source of its power. It was not the object that had called to him, not the pedestal, not the walls, but the house itself. The house was the dream. The house was the dreamer.